Up and up. Up and up 2 times.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to welcome you to today's special event with Benjamin Rhodes. Our speaker has studied at Rice University, just as many of you are now doing, and today he works directly for the President of the United States of America. So there may be a message for you here. Yes, you can. It's particularly opportune to have Ben here today with us because, as many of you know, especially the students at Rice, at the Baker Institute, we're partnering with a lot of entities across campus on leadership and promoting leadership in the Rice student community. Such entities as the Baker Institute Student Forum, the Rice Center for Engineering Leadership, the Student Leadership Program that Professor Mike Lindsay is doing. We have our DC intern program of the Baker Institute, and we just had a group, it was a Baker Institute student initiative to go to the American University of Cairo before the Troubles, just before the Troubles, and they spent 2 weeks there studying with their Egyptian student counterparts. And we have a very robust program with the top policy think tank in France, in Paris, called IFRI, in which 4 Rice students go every day. So in terms of leadership training and promotion, there's a lot going on, and of course, our speaker today exemplifies that to the 10th degree. A 2000 graduate of Rice. It's really incredible. I think it's genetic in the Rhodes family. His father and his brother David are also Rice grads. So you have 3 Rice grads in the Rhodes family. Ben double majored in English and political science. He was a member of Baker College. His professors included Max Apple, Terence Doody, Earl Black, and John Ambler. I like to think that the Baker Institute also might have an impact on his future career path, but he hasn't given me any indication of that. Ben had an early interest in fiction. He even had, according to some articles, I haven't checked this with him, he had a novel in his mind. The Oasis of Love was going to be its title. I have not discussed this with him, but when he writes his memoirs of being at the White House, it's not going to be entitled The Oasis of Love. It may have a different title. He received his MFA at NYU. He taught writing before joining the staff of Congressman Lee Hamilton and helped draft sections of the 9/11 Commission report. We first met in 2006 when we both worked for the Iraq Study Group under the co-chairs Secretary Baker and Congressman Lee Hamilton. And the first thing I asked when I saw Ben was to see his driver's license to make sure he was old enough to have access to classified information. Not only was he of age, but he turned out to be an incredible source of that report's findings. As he knows well, working together on this congressionally mandated bipartisan study group, it was a memorable experience. There were long hours. We went through 15 drafts of the report before it was published, and Ben's writing and communication skills were evident at the very outset. He did a masterful job in helping draft the Iraq Study Group report, which attracted a great deal of attention at the time. Ben joined the presidential campaign of then-Senator Barack Obama in 2007. Since then, he has contributed to some of President Obama's iconic speeches, including his historic speech in Cairo in June 2009. What I, as an old Middle East hand, consider one of the best and most important presidential statements on United States Middle East policy and toward the Muslim world. Today, Ben serves as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications and Speech Writing. I know the past few weeks have been incredibly intensive, and we truly appreciate Ben taking the time to come down here during the height of all these crises that are rolling through the Middle East and elsewhere. So we are delighted, Ben, to welcome you back to your alma mater, Rice University, and to the Baker Institute. We're delighted to have one of his favorite professors, John Ambler, Professor Emeritus of Political Science, who will moderate a discussion with Ben, and then we'll open it up to questions. I'd like to remind you all to walk up to the mics on each side of the hallway to ask the question. So please join me in welcoming Ben back to his alma mater. Ben.
Make a few opening comments. I'll just make a few opening comments and then go into the Q&A. I'll be brief because one of the problems with being a speechwriter for Barack Obama is people might make the mistake of thinking you can deliver a speech as well as Barack Obama. So I much more prefer the Q&A. I just want to say a couple things out of the discussion that I had this morning. I think there's an interest in how I got where I am and what I do during the day. I think I'll just make a few points, and then I think we'll deal with a lot of this in Q&A. When I was a senior here, I had no idea what I wanted to do with myself. I certainly didn't think I would ever work in the White House. I did get a very good education, though, and took full advantage of the fact that you had the Baker Institute, you had the programs that are here at Rice. What really changed for me, though, was I left Houston, went to graduate school, was writing a novel kind of about a guy who lived in Houston in a garden-style apartment complex and didn't know what he wanted to do with himself. And I had one of these kind of classic early 20s existences where I had like 3 part-time jobs and was going to school at night. And I was working on a city council campaign on 9/11, and that was election day in New York. That was primary day. And I was handing out leaflets in front of a polling station that was right on the Brooklyn waterfront. And I had a kind of unobstructed view of the whole scene. And saw the second plane hit, saw the towers collapse, and suddenly the world was a lot smaller for me. And I think the decision I made at that point is that whatever I wanted to do, I wanted it to be connected to what the next chapter was going to be after 9/11. That led me down to Washington. I didn't really know what I wanted to do other than I wanted to write and I wanted to work on foreign policy. I interviewed for a range of jobs. Didn't even know there was such a thing really as a speechwriter on foreign policy, but people kind of met me and connected my interest to opportunities, and I found myself with the job that Ed mentioned as a speechwriter for Lee Hamilton. So that was the kind of key decision for me, was trying to figure out how to attach my life to the events that were going on in the world. It was a whirlwind few years because of the 9/11 Commission and the Iraq Study Group. I think that one of the better experiences I had was being able to come back to the Baker Institute for that. I'll say that there's a certain interesting circularity to these things. After the report came out, some of the recommendations were embraced, some weren't. Lee Hamilton, my boss at the time, said, I'm not worried about that, Ben, because whenever they do decide to end this war, this report will be the way that they do it. One of the better experiences I had was getting to then write the speech for President-elect Obama after he was inaugurated, laying out our Iraq policy and the way forward, which very much represented, I think, that report and speaks to it. I'll just tell you a little bit about what I do during the day to give you a sense, some context for the discussion we're about to have. On the campaign, I was a speechwriter on foreign policy and domestic issues. I had a foreign policy background, but on campaigns you have to do a little bit of everything. So it was a pretty good prism because you can work on a speech for the president to give to 250,000 people in Berlin, and you can work on remarks for 40 people in a backyard in Iowa that you're just hoping the Des Moines Register shows up to cover. So we really covered the map of American politics. When I came into the administration, I just did the national security speechwriting job. But a year ago, I moved into this new position, which basically has responsibility for speechwriting on national security issues, press, so our communications at home, and public diplomacy, how we communicate in countries abroad. No 2 days are the same. I will just kind of speak, just to give you a flavor of what a day is like. This is the first day I haven't been at work in a month. And to give you a sense of what it was like during Egypt, I think is the best way to give you a sense of what I do. Essentially, every morning we come in at 7 o'clock, get the latest intelligence briefing as what's going on in Egypt. Then we'd meet as a senior staff of the National Security Council to review the decisions we had to make during the day. Then every day at 8:30 during those 18 days, we'd have a full interagency meeting. That would start with the ambassador in Cairo giving us the latest update from Cairo as to what she was seeing and hearing. In those meetings, which include the State Department, the White House, Department of Defense, we'd make decisions about who we're going to call in the Egyptian government that day, who's going to call them, what are they going to say in those calls, who are we going to call in Egyptian civil society, who are the opposition figures that we should be reaching out to talk to, what are the messages that we're going to be delivering in those calls, and then similarly, what are we going to say publicly? Because our public statements, again, represent our policy, particularly in a fast-moving situation like that. And particularly the statements that the president made were, of course, very carefully watched. And in fact, I think it's a pushback on some of the trendier analysis that America is in some kind of decline. When you look at the way in which every statement out of the United States is parsed, is studied, is critiqued in Tahrir Square, in the councils of government, in Egypt and the Arab world, I think it speaks to America's continuing influence. Nobody was parsing Hu Jintao's statements about the situation in Egypt. So we'd go through that meeting and make those decisions. Then I'd have to get together with the full interagency communicators, so the public affairs people from the State Department, bring in the people on the phone from the embassy, and make sure that the entire government is trying to speak with one voice. Figure out who is going out publicly at a senior level from the government. So again, coordinating that messaging. Then meet with the White House press secretary for half an hour and go through every question that he's going to get in his briefing, so that again he's on that message and driving exactly what it is we want to be saying. And then the afternoon becomes a matter of seeing how events develop and responding to them. Of course, the days when President Mubarak spoke were the most consequential days, and each day that he did, we'd have to turn around a presidential statement almost immediately. So you're drafting something with the president that you know is going to be consumed by billions of people around the world in a matter of minutes and hours. I think that is the most enjoyable part of the job. It's also the most stressful part. But those were fascinating moments because literally we'd be meeting. I think the most interesting moment was on February 1st when President Mubarak made kind of his first speech that clearly didn't meet the demands of the protesters. We were actually meeting in the Situation Room at the time with the president and the national security team. Stopped the meeting, turned on the TV set, and sat there like everybody else watching the speech, and then turned it off and decided how to respond to it. That's the kind of unique experience you get in public service, to be a part of events, which is the thing that led me to pursue this kind of career in New York on 9/11 and in the first instance. So that's kind of the flavor of where things have been. We're obviously in a period of time when the earth is shifting beneath our feet in the Middle East. I think that there's nothing that's going to determine the future of American foreign policy more than the events in the Middle East and North Africa over the next couple of years. We certainly have our work cut out for us. We have both, I think, Ed referred to the troubles, and while it's certainly turmoil, I think one of the principles I'll say in conclusion is that one of the things the president was very adamant about from the beginning of these protests is that we see them as opportunities, not as crises. That for all the challenges to stability in the region, and there are many, and for all the deep relationships that are very important in the United States, that when people are standing up for their universal rights, that's a good thing. And that the United States is, of course, in the position of balancing a huge array of interests. But again, the currents of history are very much moving in the right direction in that part of the world. And so with that, happy to dig into questions with my old professor here and hear from all of you.
Thank you, Ben. Is this microphone working? It is not. It's going to work all right? Good. Thank you, Ben. I when I read the Cairo speech, I concluded that was one of the most brilliant speeches by an American president I'd listened to, heard, read in my rather long career. And to my surprise, it was written by a former student of mine. What great pride, what great enthusiasm that some of our people are really having an impact. Before I ask Ben a question, let me imagine this setting. A Rice student, over vacation, let's say spring break, goes home. Father has always said that you need to have a practical education, engineering, pre-med, maybe at a stretch, economics and accounting. And so the time comes. This is the sophomore year. Well, okay, what are you going to major in? Well, I'm going to major in political science. Political science? What do you do with that? But it's all right, Dad. It's all right, Dad. I'm also double majoring in English. I'm sure your father didn't do that to you, Ben. But I've heard many, many Rice students with that sort of. Tell me then, what is your advice to Rice students who come out of political science or humanities who are interested in politics? What might they do to prepare for that sort of a career?
I'd say a couple of things. First of all, one of the things I think you don't realize when you're in college is the opportunity you have to develop a diverse knowledge set is going to end in many respects when you walk out the door here. When you look at something like the Cairo speech, I'll just take it as the example. Sure, there's politics and policy in there, but there's history and there's echoes of the colonial past and religious history. Frankly, all things that I studied at Rice. So the first instance is that while you're in school, developing that broad and general education is essential and something that you don't necessarily get the opportunity to do going forward. And so it's something that shouldn't be taken for granted. So having an English, political science, you did some classics, you're basically building, you don't know it at the time, but you're creating your own worldview through your education. Then in terms of young people getting into politics, my own personal story is one of getting involved professionally. So there's a separate academic path for people who go to grad school and develop a specialty. What my experience has been, though, is if you show up and are competent and are willing to work really hard, doors have a way of opening for people in Washington and in politics more broadly. To take just the example that I was referred to, I somehow finagled a few job interviews down in Washington in journalism. And I was meeting with a guy who edited a magazine called Foreign Policy, and he said, you don't want to come work for a magazine, you'll maybe just fact check for me. You should, if you want to learn about foreign policy and you want to write, you should be a speechwriter. I think there's a guy named Lee Hamilton who wants a speechwriter, and I kind of found myself, again, matched to the job. But I think that once you get there, first of all, you have to recognize that there are many different things you can do to kind of plug in to what's going on. There's straight politics, working on Capitol Hill, working on political campaigns. There are NGOs, there are think tanks. If you want to work in this field, you're going to get a job. You may have to be dogged, you may have to be persistent. The first job is the hardest one to get. But then once you are in the door, if you're willing to work hard and you have a Rice education, you're going to go places. I mean, there's just, young people are the people who work in these places. If you go up to walk around Capitol Hill, everybody's in their 20s. Even in the White House, partially because of the pace of the hours, it's young people. So I think, I think people need to recognize that there's more opportunities and more opportunities that come fast for young people, I think, than many people think. But then you're also going to have to make some tough choices. This was a question I got from a student earlier today, but you have to come to a fork in a road from time to time and take it, to quote Yogi Berra. But I had a couple of those. For instance, when I had that job offer in Washington, I was living in New York. I had a job offer in New York. My whole life was there. And I had a choice between kind of continuing down that path or going into the unknown of a city where I didn't know anybody and didn't really know how it was going to play out. And if I hadn't kind of taken that chance, I wouldn't have this opportunity. Similarly, moving out to Chicago to work on a political campaign for a guy who was a long shot didn't seem like the best career move at the time. A lot of people said, that's crazy, you should wait and see how the primary plays out and then try to get involved. But by going out there at the beginning, going into a little bit of debt, that's what allowed me to be where I am. So I think it's a mixture of, again, recognizing that the opportunities are there, being willing to work hard and fill space as it presents itself, and then, frankly, a few times taking risks, because that's how you're going to find good luck.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good, thanks. Speech writing. How do you and Obama work together in writing a speech? Let's take the Cairo speech, which I said I thought was brilliant. From beginning to end, how does that process work?
The bigger speeches have a similar rhythm to them. The Cairo speech I'll just take as the example since you mentioned it, but he likes to be very directly involved in the speeches, given his past history as a writer and speaker. So it'll usually start, the Cairo speech started on like a Saturday. I went into the Oval Office with the president and literally sat there for an hour, and he just spoke. Here's what I want to do in this speech. And what he'll do is he'll kind of work through the structure of the speech that he wants to give, and then give ideas within each of those kind of buckets of ideas, and that's how the speech ended up being structured. First I want to talk about extremism, then I want to talk about Arab-Israeli, and on through the list. And he'll just kind of speak, and I'll occasionally ask him questions, but it's very much I'm in receive mode, writing this all down. He'll even sprinkle in a couple of rhetorical lines that are really good. I'll never forget sitting in the Oval Office that day, and we were talking about the democracy piece of the speech. And he said, he said, one line we could use is, I said, how do you want to deal with the fact that we're in Egypt? And he said, there's one line I think we could use, that suppressing an idea never succeeds in making it go away. And we used that line in the speech. And then the first time the president spoke about the situation in Egypt, I was writing the remarks and I was trying to come up with a good line, and I said, why don't we just take that exact line from the Cairo speech and drop it in? So we did that. But anyway, it'll start with that kind of download from him. Then I'll go off and I'm also getting inputs from all kinds of different people. And when you're in the government, you can call up the intelligence community and say, send 5 guys down here to tell me what they think we should say in Cairo. It's kind of a nice perk. Then I'll do a draft, and the draft will kind of go through a number of people who need to see it will see it and offer comments and edits. And one of the most important things you have to know how to do as a speechwriter is know what to take and know what not to take. Because particularly in a bureaucracy, if you took every edit, you'd end up saying nothing. And so then you work through that process and get him a draft. And then it's really a matter of him line editing it. In the Cairo speech, he called me in and he said, I don't like this draft at all, which is not a meeting you ever want to have. And he said, this needs to be much more blunt. We shouldn't talk around these issues. We should just come out and say. Remember the line, it kind of haunted me. I'm not going to fly all the way to Cairo to dodge these issues. So I had to kind of do a pretty massive rewrite. And unfortunately, I had to do it very close to when we were getting on a plane to go to Riyadh. And we flew all night to Riyadh. And I'm literally editing the speech on the plane, giving him the draft. He's sending it back out with long written edits in the margins in the back of the speech. I don't think I slept for 3 days actually before the Cairo speech, because then we stayed up all night the next night in Riyadh. I remember being at 3 o'clock in the morning in the king's kind of compound there, hunched over a laptop with the president, still trying to get the language right. And he has this habit of being working up to the last minute, which kind of has probably taken years off my life. And so we were still working on it on the flight to Cairo. We were still making changes. But a big speech generally always follows that format. He gives a big kind of download at the beginning, do a draft, and then it's just how many drafts we have to get through. And some, there are not many drafts of edits, and some You know, the other one that he completely blew up was the Nobel speech. We did this draft for him. We thought it was great. He said, "I don't want to do this at all," you know. And he actually hand wrote out a bunch of notes on that one. And there we were on the plane to Oslo, going to land in Oslo and have him go right to give the speech. And we're feeding him pages at a time, because we couldn't even wait to do the whole draft for him to edit it. So he's literally, you know, printing page 1, getting his edits as we're printing page 2. So it's a pretty interactive process.
Do you ever hear of the reaction of people to these speeches, Cairo, for example?
Yeah, we did an interesting project after Cairo. You know, part of the public diplomacy piece of this job is that we decided that the United States needed to do a little bit more listening than we've done in recent years. And so after Cairo, we instructed all of our embassies and consulates in the Muslim world to invite people in and ask them what they thought of the speech, and to ask them, what programs do you want to work on with the United States? You know, what issues do you care about that you think that the United States can partner with you on? And we ended up having tens of thousands of instances of feedback, from electronic to roundtables to town halls. And so we got a lot of feedback. And we actually ended up designing some programs out of it. Because what's interesting is, for all the focus on political and security issues, what people said they admired about the United States and wanted to work with the United States on were education, science and technology, and entrepreneurship. Things that would actually make their life better. And we've actually ended up designing programs in all of those areas. But you know, we get a lot of feedback, and the thing that you realize when you're a presidential speechwriter is the number of audiences you have. You know, you have the American people first and foremost. You have the people in the country you're speaking in, but then you have a broader global audience. You know, and it's kind of weird to know when you write a speech that, you know, Osama bin Laden's going to issue a statement on it. You know, or one of my favorite pictures of the Cairo speech was they had Hamas. These pictures of guys in the Hamas head coverings with machine guns sitting in like a cafe watching the Cairo speech, you know, and in the back of your head you kind of know, you know, you're speaking to a lot of different people and you're never going to make everybody happy.
Wonderful. Well, you get it right most of the time, I must say. It's time for you folks to ask questions. And we have a couple of microphones. If you would come up to the microphone to ask your question, please. Who's going to start?
Ought to start, but as an old student, I have two questions. One, is writing easy for you? Does it just flow naturally?
You know, I guess it is in the sense that I like to do it, so I enjoy it. So anything that you enjoy doing is in some respects easy. But I think the other thing you have to do, particularly when you're a speechwriter and your work is going to get edited and, you know, you're not writing for yourself, you're writing for somebody else, is you have to know that the first draft is not going to be the final draft, you know. Because you could write a first draft and be very attached to it and very emotional about it and then devastated when it comes back, you know, crossed out. So you have to be, so it's easy, but you also have to have the humility to know that, particularly as a speechwriter, that your, you know, your opinion is not the most important one.
Okay. In a real world situation, where were you, literally, when Frank Wisner, former ambassador to India, who had been appointed by the Obama administration to go over and be, I'm going to call it a special diplomat on the Egyptian situation, and evidently in Germany, he said something, and I'm going to assume that he wouldn't have said it without some guidance from somewhere. Now, maybe that's wrong.
I'll correct that assumption in a minute.
Okay, and then the White House immediately responded. So where were you literally when you heard that, and how did you respond?
Yeah, no, just to review the situation, Frank Wisner was sent out in the early days of the Egyptian protest to have one conversation with President Mubarak. And he was selected because he had a relationship with President Mubarak, because President Mubarak was very isolated, and we thought for the purposes of this one conversation, it'd be good to have somebody go out who had a relationship with him. So he went out, he had that conversation. I'm not going to, read out the specifics. I mean, I think the general idea was there needed to be an understanding of the fact that things had changed in Egypt in a way that were not reversible. So he had that conversation. He came back, and that was the end of his. He wasn't a kind of an employee of the government. It was, that's a role he fulfilled. During the Egyptian protests, I think the president was very careful and pointed in his comments. And again, we put a lot of effort into coordinating our messaging. This was the problem. First of all, he did not clear either his appearance or what he was going to say with us. Basically, there's an international security conference in Munich every year. He was invited to be a panelist. He actually wasn't there in person. He videoed in. And in answer to a question, suggested that President Mubarak should stay in office for a period of time, which seemed to run counter to what we'd been saying to date. At the time, I was at the White House, and we learned of this, we were already working. It was a weekend. It was Saturday, I think, and so we were already working, and we were already meeting with the president that day. So we met with the president shortly after that, and I think the challenge for us is. And part of my job is speaking to the press. So in terms of what did I do that afternoon, I called every reporter I knew and told them, that guy's not speaking for the administration, that's not our policy. Part of the problem is, it's very hard to, in our media environment, to correct a perception that exists. So people saw that as a play by the administration to reposition our, we'd gone out pretty far. The president had gone out on Tuesday, the 1st of February, and said, there needs to be a transition in Egypt and it needs to begin now. And people saw that as kind of a walk back. But the problem is it wasn't intended to be. And so we spent about 2 days or 3 days just kind of furiously disavowing those comments. And frankly, it was necessary to spend that much time because it's logical that people would perceive that Frank Wisner would make those comments. And it's entirely logical to think that. And so once that and by the way, in Egypt, his comments got a lot of play, particularly on state television. And so we had to basically spend 2 or 3 days just aggressively saying over and over and over and over again that he wasn't speaking for the US government, that we believe there needs to be a transition, that transition needs to begin now, and needs to be meaningful and responsive to the Egyptian people. And I think we got there. I think it took us until into the next week. And we looked for every opportunity to do that, by the way. We were putting out, detailed readouts of phone calls that Vice President Biden was having with his counterpart. But I think we got there. And the reason I think we did get there is that by the time Mubarak made his very unsatisfactory speech on Thursday night, the president put out a very tough statement that night. And then by the time Mubarak finally resigned, the president had the full credibility to make the kind of speech he made. Fully siding with the protesters. I think we managed our message in a way that we were always raising the bar on the steps that the government was trying to take, and while not trying to get ahead of the protesters, certainly associating ourselves with their aspirations and their rights, so that despite the Frank Wisner piece of it, by the end of it, the president could go out and essentially give a speech saying, this is a good thing that has been done by the people of Egypt.
Mm-hmm. You talked about how public diplomacy is a big part of what you do. I guess my question is, and particularly in light of the Middle East, though, just generally, how do we communicate better with people? I mean, what ideas do you have to help America express its goals, its ideas, its concerns, and who we really are as a people more effectively, rather than letting stereotypes and propaganda get in the way of that?
Yeah. It's the fundamental question. I'd say there are a few things. First of all, we have a good asset in President Obama. He's very popular in most parts of the world. And there's nothing that can take the place of a presidential speech. That said, the president can't go around giving speeches about everything all the time. So I think there's several aspects of it that I've looked at. One is what we're saying. And what we're saying is important because often what the United States communicates about is, understandably in some respects, just what we care about. But for instance, we have a huge problem in Pakistan in terms of a population that doesn't like the United States. And one of the first things I did when I took this job is I said to some of our analysts and stuff, what are we communicating to the Pakistanis about? Well, terrorism, extremism, our message was all about security and terrorism. I said, okay, well, what are the top 5 things that Pakistanis care about? And we didn't have that analysis, really. And then when we did it, well, they care about healthcare and education and getting a job and corruption. Terrorism wasn't even on the list, right? And I don't think we think about that as Americans. We often communicate with countries about the things that we care about, but the people, the Middle East is the best example of it, right? These people care about the fact that they don't have an outlet for political expression, or that there's no jobs and opportunities for them when they get out of school. So part of public diplomacy has to be, just as we communicate our policies, which are often on these security-driven issues. And the United States has a particular burden because we are the kind of guarantor of global security. We have to weigh in on all these security issues, and we should. But we also have to make sure that as we do that, we're speaking to the issues that publics in other countries care about. So that's the first point. The second point is, how do we communicate? And a lot of our public diplomacy infrastructure was built in kind of the Cold War. We just launched 3 weeks ago a Twitter feed in Arabic and a Twitter feed in Farsi. And if you do the analysis in a lot of developing countries, they're skipping whole levels of communication. And you have people who don't have computers and even TVs, but they have cell phones. So social networks and text messaging, we need to communicate through that. We need to recognize, okay, we don't like Al Jazeera all the time. They have an editorial slant that at times is antithetical to the United States. But we need to go on Al Jazeera and explain what we're doing and make our case. And P.S., it's a lot better if we can do it in Arabic, So I think it's a matter of understanding our audiences so that we're communicating on the issues that they care about, and understanding the communications landscape so that we're reaching people through the vehicles that they receive information. And there's some very good people who do this at the State Department, and we did the analysis of, we tweet different pieces of the President's remarks on Egypt, and then watching what got retweeted. That alone is kind of a metric, right? You learn a bit what resonates with the audience by what's getting retweeted out there. So I'd say those are the 2 biggest things. And then the third thing, just quickly, is we have to understand how much people watch us. What we do in the United States, our domestic politics, our domestic arguments, our, the way in which we handle issues is very closely watched around the world. So ultimately people are looking at our example, and they follow American domestic politics and American discourse and pop culture, of course, in a way that is not true of any other country, which again I also think speaks to our influence. But I think we need to be aware of that because there's international. The clearest example was the Quran burning thing, right? But we need to be aware of the way in which what takes place here also shapes perceptions of us around the world.
As a speechwriter, who are your literary influences, and how do they shape your writing on national security issues?
It's a good question, because when I went to work on the campaign, I had this kind of weird job because I was a part of a 3-person speechwriting team. They're just generally writing campaign speeches, which can be kind of soaring and inspirational. But I had to also write foreign policy speeches, which are traditionally very dry. So the challenge I've had from the beginning is, how do you make a foreign policy speech interesting? How do you make it tell a story, essentially? And what I looked to in the campaign when I was wrestling with this question was, above all, the speeches of the 2 Kennedy brothers. If you look at a speech like the speech that JFK gave at American University about nuclear weapons, he essentially tells a story about Here's where this is the moment in history we're at. This is the problem. Here's why we need to kind of get behind an answer. And he doesn't get to the policy till like the end of the speech, you know. If you look at RFK's Day of Affirmation address in South Africa, he's got this amazing passage where he talks about flying over the Middle East and North Africa, and you know how each minute in the air is 1,000 years of history on the ground. And I mean, he just paints this picture of change that's taken place in human history to lead up to this moment in a way that by the time, you know, you're kind of on the edge of your seat waiting to hear the prescription, you know. So those are the examples I look to the most. And I used to read those speeches before I would start to write anything for then Senator Obama. Then the third thing I looked at were his books. And Dreams from My Father in particular is a very personal book with a lot of anecdotes and vignettes, and I would literally cut and paste some of those. The Cairo speech ends actually with a passage that I stole directly from Dreams from My Father, you know, where President Obama describes, it ends, you know, it's about the pulse of humanity and faith in other people. And that's how he ended Dreams from My Father. And so I literally was just taking his own words and putting it into the draft of the speech. It was interesting because he edited it. And I said, "Well, you know, you're editing yourself." And he says, "Yeah, I know. This is a different context." So his books, you know, were kind of almost destroyed in the speechwriting office by the end of the campaign, because you know both of them we would literally just kind of start speeches by keying off of stories that were in his books, because they could. You know, we knew that at least then we were in the right ballpark.
This whole situation has gotten so much more complex because originally you were dealing with Tunisia and Egypt, and now you're really dealing with, and Iran has now become an issue again, and Libya, and you've got the Israelis sort of in the middle of all this, and then you've got Bahrain and Yemen and the countries that are sort of our allies. How are you able to reach out, trying to reach out to all these different players and give consistent messages? And one last question. Are there any pundits that you all look at and pay a lot of attention to? For example, people like Tom Friedman in the New York Times or other columnists, people who have a lot of experience and have a lot of opinions about what should happen in that part of the world. Do you pay much attention to what they think and what their ideas are?
Yeah, you know, first of all, I think, on the first part of your question, you know, this is, I think what you've had is, there are a number of trends that cut across the region, in that you've had politically relatively closed societies, and you've got emerging youth populations, and that this, the dynamics in the region, something began in Tunisia that has gathered momentum, and is clearly spreading to different countries. So I think we're well aware of the fact that, again, this situation is going to play out over an extended period of time. You're going to have short, dramatic periods, such as the couple 18 days in Egypt, but there's a broader context that is going to have to work itself out over a longer period of time. And that it's going to be different in different countries. Different countries have different unique political situations, and have different factors that are informing both the protest and the government's response. What we've said is, as a matter of messaging, we have three core principles that are going to guide how we respond to any protest in any country, which is, first, we oppose the use of violence to put down protest or to attack government installations. So first is nonviolence. The second is respect for a set of universal values, the right to peaceful assembly, the right to express yourself, the right to access information, so no blockage of the internet and other media. And frankly, those things sound simple to us, but they're powerful. First of all, they're powerful because of the very fact that they haven't always been respected. So that when we're speaking up for the universal rights of people to to assemble and to speak, we're addressing issues that are of some controversy in that part of the world. And it's important to be consistent, that we would respect the same rights of assembly in Egypt as in Iran, a friendly country and an adversarial country. And third, that we support a process of political change. And this is the third one is, of course, the complex one, because that process of political reform, economic reform, that process of change is going to be different in different countries. And frankly, in some countries, the United States has long-standing ties and close ties, and some we don't. So the way in which we interact with governments and peoples in these countries is going to vary based on those factors. On the second question, I think we look at, one of the nice things, about being responsible for some of the press is that you kind of have to scan the commentary. And I think we're constantly making sure that we're not just kind of in a bubble where we're only hearing from each other, but that we're reaching out. And not only are we hearing from, not only are we reading columns from people like Fareed Zakaria and notable columnists, but in some instances we're bringing those people in. One of the things we did during the Egypt crisis is a couple of times we brought in 15 or 20 kind of leaders in their field into the White House, in part to explain what our approach was, but also to hear from them about what they thought we were doing right and what they thought we were doing wrong. So we try to make sure that that not only are we paying attention to the written commentary, but we're literally kind of reaching out to people and getting their input, their feedback, their advice, their criticism, so that we're not just in a bubble.
Mm-hmm. You're a Rice alumnus who works at the very highest levels of the government in our country, in our nation's capital. How do you think that Rice is viewed in Washington, and what impact or influence does it have?
It's a good question. I think, first of all, I worked before my current job in kind of the more policy making / academic community at the Wilson Center, and in that context, the Baker Institute, there's this kind of network of think tanks and universities that deal with public policy, and the Baker Institute is at the front of is in the first tier of being plugged into that kind of network of institutions. So I think people look at the activity of the Baker Institute specifically and what comes out of it as in the middle of the policy debates of our time. I think in terms of where I am now, I think Rice is seen as having first of all, the association with not just Baker Institute, but Jim Baker, who's remains a hugely influential figure in American politics, but then is seen as having certain areas of expertise, whether it's the academic areas of expertise that are well known, from running the gamut from science and engineering to public policy, but also within the Baker Institute, I think issues like within Rice, issues like energy, in particular, are the kinds of things that people associate with Rice. So it's seen as kind of representative of both the work that's done here and the work that's done in Houston and Texas more broadly, on issues like energy, on issues like Latin America, on our relationships with certain parts of the world that tend to pass through Houston. So I think in general, Rice is seen through that prism of the association with Jim Baker and the Baker Institute, the association with Houston and Texas, and with the association with the kind of issues that Rice has kind of carved out as being areas of expertise.
Hi. Can you describe the process by which the National Security Council balances considering foreign policy realism with promoting democratic ideals in the Middle East?
I think that we essentially have, and we dealt with this in the Cairo speech, but we've had an interesting challenge in that we have a set of interests in the region that have been enduring. For instance, obviously the security of Israel and Egypt has been, has been consistent and strong and abiding by the Camp David Treaty under President Mubarak, and now reiterated by the current government. We obviously have an interest in counterterrorism, and we have a number of partners in the region who've been important to that effort. Energy has been an interest for us, of course, as well. So we have a set of interests and a set of long-standing relationships in the region. At the same time, because we're the United States, we have to stand up for a set of values. And in recent days, a lot of the indigenous democratic movements in that part of the world have been about people grasping for those values. So the United States has to, again, say that no matter what the circumstance, we're going to say that we speak out for a set of rights that we think are universal and that cut across whatever kind of country in which that's taking place, be it one that's friendly to us or adversarial. But I think there's a bigger argument to be made here, which is that people often put this as a choice between stability and democracy. But the fact of the matter is, the status quo is not stable. It's not like a failure to change and a failure to reform is going to be a stable situation in which things are the way they've been. So I think the point that we've been trying to make is, publicly and privately, the long-term stability of the region is actually going to come from democratic change. That an Egypt that goes through a transition to a genuine democracy is actually going to be more stable than the Egypt of the last couple of years. What we have is an historic opportunity in some respects to align our interests and our values. If these transitions lead to, again, a more democratic region that's more responsive to the aspirations of its people. And I think one of the interesting things about the recent protests, too, is the extent to which they're not about us, or they're not about Israel, or they're not about kind of the normal churn of political issues. They're about the future that the people of these countries want. We have to see that and respect that. But again, I think the argument we need to be continually making is that ultimately our interests will be served and the stability of the region will be served through a process of political evolution that is more responsive to the people we're seeing in the streets.
You become a real diplomat, Ben. One more question, if we have time. Good.
My question is on policymaking within the administration. Do you find that there's a realist block and idealistic block within policymakers, or do you think that it differs on each issue?
I think that you get on any given. I think it does depend on the issue, and I think the challenge is it's not as simple as it's not as simple as simply choosing to be idealist, because in any given situation, there's usually not a kind of purity of position that can be achieved. Take the instance of China. What's the idealistic goal? The idealistic goal is respect for human rights in China. Respect for human rights, whether it's generally speaking or whether it's the religious and cultural identity of the people of Tibet or whichever issue you want to pick. And I think the challenge is how do you achieve that goal? Do you achieve it through a kind of painstaking, rigorous engagement with the Chinese government, where you're raising these issues privately, you're addressing them publicly, you are, again, you're kind of wrestling with the problem over time in direct engagement with the Chinese? Or do we just kind of pull back and condemn behavior that we don't like and kind of break off that kind of engagement as a protest, essentially, to what we don't like. Similarly, similar questions, present themselves in all parts of the world. The Middle East is not distinct from that. And so I think that the challenge that I think of myself as an idealist. That's certainly why I got into this line of work and went to work for Barack Obama instead of any of the other candidates. I think the challenge becomes how do you achieve idealistic ends, and those are tough policy calls. Because you know what, sometimes it is the right thing to do, to say enough is enough, we're going to issue a strong statement of condemnation, we're not going to abide by this. But often you're going to have to try to pursue a better outcome by engaging governments you don't agree with, by working quietly behind the scenes instead of publicly, because to go public would compromise your ability to make progress in private. So I think when you actually get in government and you have to wrestle with it on a daily basis, as an idealist, I think one of the things you come to understand is that there's no straight line to achieve the realization of your idealism. You have to figure out what the best strategy is for each of the issues in front of you, and calibrate your approach to that. But sometimes you have very satisfying days, and I think on last Friday, when the president was able to go out and speak to what the people of Egypt had accomplished, was one of those days.
It's not often that we have one of our own here to talk to us about what he's doing at the very center of power. And I come away reassured we are well represented. Thank you very much, Ben.
Thanks.